This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Our country, which it's true, but I wasn't satisfied by it because it's, again, how? You assume that everybody has ideas in their heads, but those ideas may be wrong. So anyway, with these questions in mind, I went around over several years and I visited 52 embassies and consulates and interviewed about 600 career diplomats and the last 7 secretaries of state. I had covered the last 4 and traveled with the last 4, but then the George Schultz, Jim Baker, and Warren Christopher helped as well. And so let me introduce to you just 4 of those 600 and give you just a very brief idea of what some of the things they've done in their careers to show you what the Foreign Service currently does or has had to do in the last few years, and you'll judge whether it's different from what you thought they were doing or not. The first of these diplomats is Cameron Munter, who was the American ambassador to Pakistan the last 2 years. He just left and retired from the Foreign Service. But he was one of the very few people who watched that video feed of the raid that killed bin Laden in May of last year. There were a couple of feeds in Washington, then one in Kabul, one in Pakistan. And then he and his team had to explain to the Pakistani government why it had no idea that a foreign military operation was taking place in their country. But that wasn't the hard part. What was much more difficult was then to repair the relationship, because the raid came 4 months after a CIA contractor, undercover contractor, killed 2 Pakistanis. And 5 months after the raid, a NATO airstrike inadvertently killed 24 Pakistani soldiers. So these are big blows to a very, very strenuous relationship to begin with. So as an ambassador, between the rock and the hard place, really, because Washington has its own things and instructions, and then you're actually in the country, in Islamabad, and you've got the Pakistanis to deal with. So that wasn't easy. But before he was in Pakistan, Munter was the ambassador to Serbia. And in Serbia, his embassy was attacked in 2008 when the US recognized Kosovo as an independent state. A few hundred Serbs attacked it. Part of it was set on fire, and the ambassador received intel that the person who'd approved the attack was the Prime Minister of Serbia, Vojislav Koštunica, the guy I interviewed for the FT in December of 2000, right after he won the first election and after Milosevic. So the ambassador decided that he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that that guy did not win re-election. And the election was only 4 months away, 5 months away. And he engineered a very, very sophisticated operation behind the scenes. He didn't even tell Washington about it. Condoleezza Rice had no idea that he was doing that. He even involved Prime Minister Zapatero of Spain and the future Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou, who were the heads of Socialist International, because the most effective way Munter decided to make sure that Koštunica lost the election was to get his coalition partner, Socialist Party of, or whatever it's called, it's in the book, as Munter put it, to put a knife in Koštunica's back, and that's what happened. So Koštunica was out of power. This other guy, who ended up withdrawing his support from Koštunica's party, became then, 4 years ago, the deputy prime minister, and this past July he became the prime minister. So the current prime minister of Serbia has a lot to thank to this guy. Now, is this interference in another country's domestic affairs? You be the judge. But Munter thought that no leader of a country should be approving attacks on any embassy, and so he thought that he shouldn't be in power. Is it his position? Again, that's not, that's up to the discussion. But the last thing I wanted to mention about Munter, who actually joined the Foreign Service in 1985, before Serbia, he was the leader of what's called the PRT, a provincial reconstruction team in Iraq. And there were more than 30 of those teams until the military left Iraq last year. And so what he and his team did was basically teach that province. He was based in Mosul in the north of Iraq, but to teach that province how to govern itself. There was no self-governance in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, as you well know. So these are basic things: how to set up a judicial system, how to build infrastructure from scratch, how to build schools and hospitals, how to pave roads, how to make sure that you have a functioning electricity and water supply lines. Basic things that you need basically to lead a normal life. And while they were doing this, they were living in an army base in Mosul, and they would convoy out to the city council hall every morning. And he told me every day they were attacked, whether it was a roadside bomb or rocket fire, they were attacked every day when he was there. The second of the four diplomats is Yuri Kim, who is a Korean American. She's currently the political counselor in Ankara, and she has spent a lot of time in the past year working with Turkey to get Bashar al-Assad to stop killing his own people in Syria. Clearly not very effectively, but that's another story. When Munter was dealing with the embassy on fire in Belgrade, she was in North Korea. The US has no relations with North Korea, so there's no embassy, but she was visiting, she was accompanying the New York Philharmonic, which had a concert in North Korea, which in fact she had also negotiated. She took part in the nuclear talks that were going on at the time as well. The third person is David Lin Wall, who came back recently from Baghdad, where he was the political military counselor at the embassy. And his main job was to sell American weapons to the Iraqi government. As you may know, one of the things the American Foreign Service does is selling American weapons to foreign countries. The thing that he did before Baghdad, he was DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission in Haiti, and managed the search for missing Americans after the earthquake in 2010. His house collapsed, and he's alive today only because he was not at home. Otherwise, he would have been killed, as was in fact killed, or one of the other embassy people, the cultural affairs officer, Victoria DeLong. She was killed because she was in her house. And before that, he was DCM in Guatemala. And one of the main things he did there was help reform the Guatemalan child adoption system. Did you know that American diplomats reform child adoption systems? I didn't. Why do they care? I mean, why do they care about improving the system by which children are being adopted in Guatemala? Because it turns out many Americans adopt Guatemalan children. In fact, Guatemala is number 3 on the list, after only Russia and China, of number of children from where Americans adopt. And apparently that system was so corrupt that Americans were wasting thousands of dollars on bribes. And Congress put pressure on the Foreign Service to change that. There was a much more complex effort in Chile back in about 2000, the late 90s and 2000, to reform the judicial system in Chile. Because until then, Chile did not have trials. One judge decided everything. So there were trials on appeal, but not until then. And so one of the things the embassy did, in addition to the legal training and bringing down lawyers and other legal experts, they also brought down American architects to teach the Chileans how to build courthouses, because they didn't have any. They didn't have trials. Why they needed courthouses. And the last of these four is Gavin Sandwall, whom I met in Beijing in 2003, where he headed the so-called American Citizen Services section. He was a consular officer, and so that section is supposed to help Americans, whether it's issuing them temporary passports or registering a childbirth or a death, or helping a tourist who's been mugged or attacked. He began his career in '98 in Panama, and one of the first things he did was he found himself sitting in a Panamanian jail across from 2 Satanist killers. And he was there because they were American citizens, and he was sent to make sure that they were treated humanely by the Panamanian authorities according to the Vienna Conventions. He just came back from Kabul, where he was the press attaché at the embassy. And you might remember a few months ago, an American soldier killed 16 Afghans in cold blood, mostly women and children. I think they're all women and children. And a few months earlier, there were some American soldiers who burned Korans. And so this guy had to help put out those public relations fires, and that's clearly not a very easy task. But so let's review what I just said. Some of the tasks, because this is a very short list of what Foreign Service does. So we have teaching effective governance, we have nuclear negotiations, cultural events, reforming child adoption system, selling American weapons, recovering from natural disasters, promoting American business, which I didn't mention this because these people haven't done it, but promoting American business is done every day by every embassy and consulate around the world, whether it's opening new markets or expanding existing markets for American companies, lowering or eliminating tariffs or other import duties or anything that has to do with how to make it easier for American companies to sell their products or in foreign markets. Then we have issuing passports and visas, which of course you know about, visiting prisoners in jail to make sure they're treated humanely, and then fixing public relations problems. A very partial list, but I don't know of any other profession that requires you to do things like that. And we're not talking about specializations. Doesn't mean that there are specialists in the Foreign Service who do some of these things. No, they're expected to do all of this. And in anyone's career, you probably will end up doing 3 or 4 of these things at some point. And in my mind, the question was, why? How does this make sense? Do we need to do all this? And I went to a document called the National Security Strategy, which is published by every president. And this is according to the last one, which is not very different from the last Bush strategy. And so here's what the White House expects the Foreign Service to do: help prevent conflict, spur economic growth, strengthen weak and failing states, lift people out of poverty, combat climate change and epidemic disease, and strengthen institutions of democratic governance. That sounds very ambitious, doesn't it? I mean, how do you do this? How much money do you need to do this? Or how many people do you need? To me, it sounds impossible. I mean, the question really is, why strengthen weak and failing states? Why lift people out of poverty? Well, seriously, why do we care about people in Zambia, and why do we need to try to reduce the poverty rate in Zambia or any other country in the world? And because I was trained at the Kennedy School, in my mind, anything that a government does overseas should be linked directly to the national interest. Otherwise, why are you spending taxpayers' money? So, what is the American national interest? This actually applies to any country, particularly any Western country. So, there is agreement on this in the 2 parties, by the way. So, the last 2 administrations agree on this. The first part of the national interest is security. You care about the security of your country and the safety of your citizens. Clearly, every president, that's his first priority. Then it's the prosperity of the country. And finally, it's the values. And the values, democracy, human rights, equality, the values are static, that you can promote them, but you really focus on the first 2. And so, security. To make the story short, this administration and the Bush administration decided that for the US to be truly secure, the entire world must be secure and stable. These 2 oceans no longer protect the country. So truly, no security and stability in the United States can be achieved until the entire world is stable. The same goes to prosperity. For the US to be truly prosperous, because of globalization, open markets, trade, and 24/7 news cycle, instant communication, and easy travel, you need to have, if not the entire world be prosperous, which won't happen in the next few thousand years, but at least have as many countries as possible that have a functional economy, so they can produce some economic growth. Clearly, it's difficult to preach this overseas when in your own country things are not going well economically and you have a high unemployment rate, but they've been doing it even through that time. So how does this go to the mission of the Foreign Service? So this world that the White House is seeking, the world that's secure and stable, doesn't exist right now. But they say that's the world we seek. And so it's the task of the Foreign Service of the United States to help bring that about. Condoleezza Rice used to call this transformational diplomacy. It was a politically charged term, and Hillary Clinton hasn't used it, but some people thought it was about transforming other countries in the US image, which clearly wasn't very popular. So I'm told that wasn't what the actual goal was. Some people in the Bush administration, the sort of the more ideological members, might have had this in mind, imposing democracy. But in reality, Condi didn't mean that, and the Foreign Service never bought into it. I mean, nobody wants to go and impose democracy on anyone. It was about governance. It was about good governance, and I'll mention that in a minute. And by the way, I should have prefaced this. I've never worked for the American government. I have nothing to do with them. They didn't ask me to write this book. I'm just trying to make sense of this. So if I sound like I'm giving you slogans, that's not what my intention, and I'm just trying to see what they're saying and what they're doing and how that actually makes any sense. But at the same time, the White House recognizes the world as it is, and that's what they call it in the national security strategy. They call it the world as it is, and they also realize they have to deal with it. Things happen. Libya happens. Syria happens. You have to deal with it. And what's the best tool you have? Any country has. It's diplomacy. And so that's the classic diplomacy part, the traditional diplomacy, the negotiations, the agreements, managing foreign relations. And so, finally, I was able, after pulling teeth and asking people what they do and what their mission is and how it goes back to the big picture of American foreign policy, this is what the mission is. Dealing with the world as it is and bringing about, or trying to bring about, a more secure and prosperous world so the US can be more secure and prosperous. That is, in short, what they're supposed to do. And these two parts of the mission, the traditional diplomacy and the transformational diplomacy, are obviously very different. On the traditional side, there are four main functions. The first one is managing foreign relations, which in a way Cameron Munter did in Serbia by getting rid of the Prime Minister, or helping get rid of the Prime Minister. The second function is representing the United States, which I also mentioned, and its people. The third is assisting American citizens, which I also mentioned. And the fourth is the so-called multilateral diplomacy, which is managed by the UN, NATO, EU, and all these international organizations. But transnational issues don't have to be managed by the UN. There are many issues on which the US works with other countries regionally, but UN is not that involved, or NATO is not that involved. And so you still work, for example, the Greek crisis. That's something that the UN is not really involved in. The EU clearly is, but the US is not part of the EU. In spite of that, still an enormous amount of time is spent on trying to figure out what that means for the US and prevent even worse from happening. And then transformational diplomacy. So why is good governance so important? This is now the big thing. Since 9/11, this is the mantra. This is the big slogan, if you want. Good governance. It's not about just helping people in other countries. It's not giving foreign aid because you're nice or because there is need in Africa or elsewhere for food and other essential products. You do it because you want as many countries in the world to be well governed. Why is that? Well, the argument is a conflict, an internal conflict in any country, look at Syria, can spill over to the neighbors and then the region and then affect the entire continent and ultimately affect or harm American interests. And so the logic behind this is you help a country improve its governance. So what does that mean? That means having a government that's responsible, accountable to its people, respecting their rights, providing basic services, and economic opportunity. So if you're talking about an accountable government, it's basically talking about a democratically elected government, right? It doesn't say democracy promotion, but it really, in effect, it is, because these are the governments that are accountable and responsible. Now, there are exceptions. Take Singapore. Many people will say that there is no true democracy in Singapore. I mean, the same party has been in power since independence from Britain, right? Since 1963. But Singapore is all the time given as an example, as a shining example of good governance. So clearly there are exceptions. So if the thinking is, if you have a country with good governance that provides enough jobs to its people, then you won't have some of those people, particularly young men, looking for other means to feed their families, and then turning to crime, terrorism, drug trafficking, human trafficking, whatever it is. And so that's why the Americans are now saying, we need to help these countries improve their governance. We'll give them foreign aid, but it's not just because they're suffering. There are many people suffering around the world. We can't help every one of them. But we're giving the foreign aid to these people because we want that country to reach a point when it no longer will need foreign aid. It will be self-sustained. So let's see now with this ambitious agenda around the world. Basically, this is about changing the world, making the world a better place. Then the question arises: better for whom? Clearly for the US, because that's how it believes it will become more stable and more secure. But is it better for the people in those countries you're trying to reform or to transform? And as I've gone around the world to 82 countries, I know that in many countries people think if something is better for the US, or if the US wants something to happen, then it must be not good for us. I'm sure they have their reasons and their arguments make sense in various ways, but it doesn't have to be so. In other words, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. You don't have to have a loser in that case. You can argue it is good for a country to have better governance. It is good for the Central African Republic or Uganda to have better governance. And by extension, then you're saying, well, a better governed country anywhere in the world is better for the US. It's up, as I mentioned, I was in Jordan last night. They're not buying it, okay? So, and I'm not trying to preach, I'm just saying what the thinking is behind what American diplomacy does. But let's look at the resources. The American Foreign Service in 2011 had $53 billion budget. That included foreign aid, which was $35 billion, or less than 1% of the federal budget of GDP. There are 13,000 members of the American Foreign Service, clearly more than any other foreign service in the world. 8,000 of them are diplomats or foreign service officers, and 5,000 foreign service specialists. Secretaries, IT people, security people, accountants, and other professions. Still more than any other countries, and these both figures are larger than at any other time in history. So the US never had a bigger budget for foreign affairs or more people in the foreign service. Armed Forces of the United States, $646 billion in their budget. About, 12 times bigger. And the people, the active duty members of the US Armed Forces are 1.4 million. This does not include people in the reserves or civil servants at the Pentagon. This is just active duty military. I'm not saying they should be equal, I'm just giving you the numbers. And if you're trying to change the world, then how much can the military help? Is it their business to help? Should some of the resources be shifted? And the last couple of things I want to mention are the sort of the techniques that I used in the book, because I didn't want to write an academic book. I don't dislike academia. I just wanted to write. I know there are other people who write those books, but as a journalist, to me, it's all about telling stories. And I wanted to write a book that was practical, pragmatic, and it's humanized diplomacy in the Foreign Service. So my first technique was humanizing diplomacy. I want to have, to everything I say in the book, I want it to have stories. Whether it's in Serbia or Iraq or Afghanistan or in Chile or in any other country. And bring it to life in a way. So in this humanizing thing, I found out there are three aspects that have been going on since 9/11. The first one was in the Foreign Service itself. It used to be that most people in the Foreign Service were either from Ivy League schools or they had some background in foreign affairs. Or the Foreign Service was elitist, as many people think of it still. I was doing a radio interview in Washington last week, and the host said, "Well, the Foreign Service is so elitist." I said, "Well, actually, not quite anymore. If you go to the people who've come in the past 5 or 10 years, or you go to the incoming new classes of Foreign Service officers, the diversity is just stunning. Not enough yet in terms of ethnic background. I mean, still 80% is white. 5% only black and 7% Asian. But women are now 40%, which is big. The diversity is mainly when it comes to professional experience. It's really very interesting and hard to believe, but any profession you think of, there are people who used to do it in the Foreign Service. Lawyers, journalists, architects, poets, gallery directors. There was even a parole officer from Staten Island when I was at the embassy in Mexico City a few years ago. I don't think there is any other Foreign Service that will take someone who worked in a prison and make him a diplomat. The second aspect of this humanizing trend is opening up American diplomacy to the people of other countries. In other words, they're trying now to have a diplomacy that is not only between governments, and take it directly to the people in other countries through private sector, civil society, NGOs, non-profits, but also just private citizens. Because the logic is that, or the argument is, that even in countries that are not democracies, public opinion makes a difference. Mubarak cared about public opinion. Hey, the Iranians cared about public opinion in 2009 after the election, right? They did, because they banned the access to Facebook and Twitter, or whatever they did. So now the Americans want to jump over the heads of governments and reach directly those foreign publics to explain a policy or whatever it is. And the last aspect is opening up to the American public. Hillary Clinton's been trying to get, or to encourage Americans to contribute to American diplomacy. It's not very clear how exactly that might happen. There is an office at the State Department that's thinking about this, but it's not clear to me how exactly an average American citizen can contribute to American diplomacy. Unless they work at a company that can, for example, Amazon, that can provide free Kindles for teaching English around the world. That's one way, but that's not exactly, that's private sector. And the second trend is what I call the Foreign Service's identity crisis. And that had to do with all these duties that I mentioned at the beginning. After 9/11, the Foreign Service was asked to do more and more and more and more. And so these people one day said, wait a second, we came in here with a certain perception of diplomacy and certain expectations of what we were supposed to do. What we are being asked to do, that's not diplomacy, at least in our minds. As one of them said in the book, I'm being asked to go to Iraq and talk to village elders about digging wells. I don't know anything about digging wells. I've never seen anyone do it. I've never talked to anyone who's done it. But am I a better value to my government doing that, or being a public diplomacy officer, which is what I'm trained to do? So after 9/11, particularly after the Iraq War, with this basically rebuilding Iraq province by province method that Condoleezza Rice was an advocate of, and she started the PRTs. That's what you had to do: go by province, stabilize Iraq with the help of the military, who of course were there. But when it came to governance, the military was out, and it was the State Department and the Foreign Service who did it. the biggest problem was that they were sent to Iraq without any training. Okay, they gave them some basic things, not language, not really area studies. They told them how to shoot for a day and a half. They took them to West Virginia and showed them how to shoot. They don't even carry your weapons, right? So it was just in case. But this is big in the Foreign Service. Improvisation is big. So the theory is you can't really learn this stuff in the classroom, so you'll have to do it learn by doing it. And as many people said in the book, it's like, not just Iraq, anything, any place in the Foreign Service. People said it's like being thrown in a pool and you have to learn how to swim. They don't teach you. And the concern to me is even bigger now that we have so many people coming in who have no background in foreign affairs or international relations. They do need to be taught, and they're not. They're given basic orientation, which is not worth much, and I've actually sat through it, to some of it. But figuring things out as they go is how they do it. And the other thing that has become a trend in the last decade is that strategic thinking is not really encouraged in the American Foreign Service. In fact, as one of Yuri Kim, who you saw, the Korean American, she said it's actually strategic thinking is beaten out of you in the Foreign Service. We are supposed to be operational now. It's all about getting things done. You are in some country in the middle of nowhere. You need to take care of the business of the United States. Whatever needs to be done, you have to know how to do it. If you don't know, you have to learn in 5 minutes how to do it. So that brings me to my conclusion, which is one of my other surprises was that it turns out nobody in Washington has actually sat down to think through what kind of foreign service they want in 5 or 10 years. And to me, if you don't know the answer to that question, how do you know what kind of skills you want? And then, if you don't know that, how do you know what kind of people to recruit? How to test them and how to then train them? I think the American Foreign Service is still years ahead of the other countries' foreign services just because, in this new century now, these new tasks are being added. And who else can afford this? What other country can afford to do this, to basically transform the world? And has the resource. I mean, the Canadians are cutting resources for diplomacy. The Australians are doing the same thing. So clearly the Americans, not that they have that much money because they have a huge debt now, but clearly they think they can do it. And what they're saying is it's actually a great deal to invest this money into the foreign service because that means we are doing preventative work, and so we don't have to spend 10 times more on the military if it comes to conflict. And that's why they're saying the American people are getting a great return on their value, on their taxpayers' dollars, because by financing the foreign service and diplomacy, the likelihood of another war is less likely. Who knows? Time will prove. But anyway, I'll conclude with that and leave time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad we've doubled in size since the beginning.
Well, we've got about